everyone. Today we are here with Ms. Connie Mercer, the CEO of HomeFront and an influential figure who has been fighting against homelessness for the past 30 years. So Ms. Mercer, you've obviously been in this field for a long time. So could you please tell us how you first got involved in the fight against homelessness?
Sure. In fact, there's quite a story there. I had been working in the child welfare field, leading the child welfare system in Illinois for a long time. And I was very tired when I came back home. I said, I'm going to go do something else and make some money. An awful lot of really good social workers that sometimes say that. I was in my office, fancy office, doing work where I was making a lot of money as an executive recruiter. And a friend of mine came and said, Connie, you need to come with me and see what's happening. And he took me to motels along the Route 1 corridor. And we knocked on door after door after door. And what we saw were hundreds of families that were warehoused in these grim welfare motels where people did not have any refrigeration or a baby's bottle, could not cook a meal, where there was one single bed, a TV, and then all of their earthly possessions around them. There was no dignity there was no hope. And the worst things were the surroundings, because in the motels, that's where drug dealers were on one side and prostitution on the other. At the end of the visit, my friend, Dr. Hansen, turned to me and said, Connie, there are hungry homeless kids in your community. Fix it. And I took up the challenge because I believed then, as I still believe today, that we have a communications problem, and that if everybody in our wealthy county, Mercer County, with Princeton, West Windsor, incredibly wealthy communities, if they knew that there were homeless children, they wouldn't allow it. Mm-hmm. So I took up the fight, and I got together a bunch of my friends on Thanksgiving, which was real close to when I'd been out. And we began by delivering meals to these godforsaken motels. My friends told their friends, and they started bringing meals, and their friends told their friends, and soon we had an army of volunteers bringing meals to desperate people living in motels. One year, a group of volunteers delivered over 350,000 meals to the motels along the Route 1 corridor. But we knew that wasn't enough. When you're bringing meals to people, you soon see that when they come out to the car to get the meals, it's the middle of the winter and the kids only have sandals on. And the parents have no winter coat, so you start collecting stuff. And then you realize, oh my God, the children are depressed, seriously depressed. So you start figuring out ways to get them out of those godforsaken motels, and you start running some kids' activities. So it was all a ragtag bunch of volunteers, hundreds of volunteers that I coordinated. We then, but we knew that we were putting Band-Aids on, and feeding people is real important, but that's only a Band-Aid. So we went looking for a permanent site away from those cursed motels, and we found a permanent place in a government building, and we housed 48 homeless families at a time. And there we began to make a real difference, because there we could provide childcare, we could provide education, we could provide the tools to get people out of homelessness. So that's how I began.
Wow, that's a very touching story. So, as like the CEO of HomeFront, could you tell us a bit about what HomeFront does and like what are the primary services you provide for these people?
HomeFront understands that clawing your way out of poverty is an incredibly difficult task, and that it takes a whole bunch of tools in order to get out. So we have 4 core pillars. First and foremost is housing. And on any given night, HomeFront is sheltering over 500 people, most of them kids. We shelter them in a variety of settings, from a award-winning, state-of-the-art shelter to permanent affordable housing. Our sister agency that we created builds permanent affordable homes for low income people. We also do, when necessary, transitional housing, because not everybody who leaves our shelter is ready to make it on their own in permanent housing. And we have a transition period where we provide the housing, we pay the rent, we pay the utilities, and in exchange we make the rules. First core value principle pillar is housing. The second one is tools for independence. We need to teach our folks how to get out of poverty. We need sometimes to teach them to read, sometimes teach them to speak English, sometimes teach them parenting skills, almost always teach them how to better care physically for themselves and their dental health. And help people get their high school equivalency diploma and help them get certification for various jobs so that they can make a living wage. That's the second pillar. The third pillar is we believe that in order to lead a life of dignity, people need stuff. You can't just put somebody into an apartment without beds or kitchen table to gather around and expect them to prosper. So we have quite a large program of giving out stuff. Last year, we gave out over $5 million worth of donated goods and services. When we can, we give people cars, because we understand that in our community, and like so many in New Jersey, it's very difficult to function without a car. Just plain old stuff. Food. We feed thousands of people every month with a very large food bank. And the fourth pillar is children. We believe that all children deserve to have all the experiences, good experiences in life that can lead to a happy, successful future. So an awful lot of our energies are concentrated on making sure that our kids of poverty have the same life experiences that the rest of the children in the community have, and that they get to do the fun stuff. They get to see a different way of living. So those are our 4 core pillars.
Thank you. So are you focused in Mercer County specifically, or do you also work across New Jersey?
We mostly are in Mercer County. We decided to go deep as opposed to going wide. We have helped people take the HomeFront model and to replicate it in different places, but Mercer County is our home base.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you provide like emergency shelters and transitional services. So how does one like go about reaching out to HomeFront to receive this assistance?
There are no wrong doors for HomeFront. Most of the time you come and knock on the door and say, hey, I need help. In Mercer County, if you're poor and hungry, you know about Mercer, you know about HomeFront. Lots of agencies refer to us, most primarily the welfare department, but all of the agencies know us.
Mm-hmm. Are there any primary groups or demographics you seem to tend to serve to?
When we began 30 years ago, the description was almost always of a single female with children under the age of, and the mom was usually under the age of 25, and the other group we saw were grandmas with kids. Things have changed since then, and now we see many more families with men in them. About 20% of our families now have men in them. Some are single male headed households. We used to see people who were mired in long-term poverty. Now we see more and more people who go to work every day, but who simply can't afford a place to live.
Mm-hmm.
So recently, since the pandemic, our profile is changing, and we're seeing more and more diverse people. Because our community is changing, we're also seeing more and more Latinos and folks who have recently come from Africa.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like there are any common misconceptions people seem to hold about homelessness?
Oh my, where do I start? One is that people choose to live this way. But probably the most difficult one is that all too often homeless people are seen as being people without value, people who don't matter, people who have no talents. One of the ways that we fight that stereotype is we have two main ways. One, we have lots and lots of volunteers, thousands of volunteers every year, and when people see our families up close and personal, and they see that those parents want for their kids, the same things they want for their kids, the stereotypes begin to change. But the other way that we work to fight that is we have a very large art program and a very large sewing program, and our clients make incredible, beautiful, amazing, jaw-dropping stuff, and we have lots of art shows in our community, lots of craft shows, to say, hey, this is what a homeless person has done. And somehow seeing a beautiful, meaningful poem with a picture attached that a homeless woman has done, you have to reconsider and say, oh my God, there's so much talent there. We need to make sure that it can be used.
Yeah.
In fact, the only thing that I've ever, I've been doing this a very long time, and the only stereotype that I can tell you about homeless people that is largely true is that by and large they have horrible teeth.
Mm-hmm.
The system just doesn't pay to make sure that poor people have teeth that are good.
So what are the best actions that we, as a whole, as a community, can take to help solve homelessness? And what can youth like me do in particular to help?
You can tell your community leaders, and they'll hear you. They won't hear my homeless clients because they think they don't have value, but you are, and folks who care like you are folks who have standing in the community. So you're speaking for the voiceless. You can tell your community leaders that you care that there are homeless children in your community, that you care that there are children who don't have the same chance that you do, and that there isn't a level playing field. You can tell them loud and clear that you want there to be more affordable housing in your community, that it is something that matters.
Yeah.
That's the most important thing you can do. And that, I know that sounds pretty daunting, but it's amazing how eager local representatives are to hear from kids like you. That's the big thing that can be done. The other stuff that can be done that really matters are things like organizing food drives.
Yeah.
And organizing diaper drives. And just talking about the horrors of homelessness and how homeless kids tend to be far behind in school. That's because if you've moved 8 times during the school year, which is what a homeless kid does, they are essentially poverty nomads, and they move from grandmother's house to the boyfriends of the mom's house. When that doesn't work out, then they go to a motel for a little while, and then they find a place until they can't pay the rent. So they bounce from place to place. And if you happen to be at a school where they're just beginning to teach fractions and you're out of school, or if you move immediately into a school when they are teaching you how to do algebra and you've never had fractions, you can't do well.
Yeah. Really put at a disadvantage.
You're such a disadvantage, yes, sir.
Mm-hmm. So are there any challenges regarding homelessness that are unique to our community in New Jersey?
High cost of living and the high cost of housing.
Mm-hmm.
So, I guess this year we're the 4th most expensive state in the country in terms of rental costs. I think it's 4th changes. So the high cost of housing is a major barrier.
Mm-hmm.
One of the distinctions that we haven't gotten into, because I only deal with homeless families that have kids. A lot of the issues with homeless singles is very different. When it's an adult who's without children who's homeless. In that population, you do see an awful lot more mental illness and drug addiction than I do. If you're homeless and still have your kids, you probably are not addicted, because otherwise the state takes the kids away. You're probably not mentally ill. But in the single population for homeless, the lack of mental health services is a huge barrier. The reality is that a number of years ago, when the state decided, for some humane reasons, but also to save money reasons, to essentially empty the mental hospitals without any real planning for community resources, the jails and the shelters became mental hospitals, filled with people with mental illness in the single shelters, and we have no resources to deal with that. Getting resources into the shelters, mental health resources, behavioral health resources, would make a huge difference. And that's something kids like you can advocate for, is getting services into the shelters.
Yeah. So, how has homelessness changed since you started working all those years ago to support the homeless?
In my community, it's changed. We've already discussed the issue of there being men who are with families.
Yeah.
And that's a big shift. We now, as a community have better ways of moving people out of homelessness. In the old days, people used to linger for days, for years in a homeless state. We now have really, as a community, gotten pretty good about figuring out how to help somebody get out of a homeless state. And that makes a world of difference. We don't necessarily provide enough supports once they get out of being homeless to keep them out of homelessness for a long time, but it's much better.
Yeah.
It's much, much better.
You mentioned that COVID impacted like the way your organization operated. How do you feel that COVID has affected the homeless community in general?
The COVID has put a huge stress on shelters, which are the backbone of the homeless system. Staff that were scared and left the field entirely. One of the ways, Ishan, that it really hurt is that at my shelter, which normally these days takes 38 families, cut down to 20 to keep more social distancing. But my fixed costs were the same. So when you half your population and you still have the same fixed costs, you get in trouble financially, and that's true across our sector. In terms of the folks who are single and who are out there, they lived in terror of homelessness because part of they couldn't isolate, just impossible to isolate, or to shelter. You were told to shelter at home. But if you have no home, there's no way to shelter.
Yeah. So besides, like, you mentioned affordable housing, are there any other shortcomings that we have as a state in serving the homeless?
I would have said yes before our current governor and his administration. They're really pretty enlightened in terms of dealing with homeless in many regards. The one thing I would say is that New Jersey government, like all governments, are incredibly bureaucratic and have too many rules to follow and too much paper to fill out, that sometimes makes it so that the folks who most need the help don't get the help because they can't produce their birth certificate or their driver's license. What happens when you flee a fire or domestic violence, or when you've just lived in 8 places in a year, you lose your papers.
Yeah.
And demanding all of the paperwork that they do gets in the way. I recently had a family of 8 that had come from Puerto Rico. They did not have the birth certificate for the baby, although the baby was always in the mother's arms. And we could have gotten them housed using government funds, except for the fact that we didn't have a birth certificate for the baby, although we had the baby. And getting a birth certificate out of Puerto Rico these days is near impossible. So that requirement got in the way of getting the family what they needed. Fortunately, we were able to raise private funds to put them someplace, to help them find it someplace safe to be.
That's great.
Well, it's great, but government should be able, I think it's a basic function of government to make sure that at least all the children are safely housed.
Yeah. So I understand that you're retiring in September. Do you have any plans for what you'll be doing in the future?
Well, I'm graduating from HomeFront after 31 years. And I'm going to be moving on to run the New Jersey Coalition to End Homelessness.
Wow.
Trying to work at a statewide level. Trying to make sure that all of the counties have the kind of resources that we do in Mercer County to fight the scourge of homelessness. I'm getting pretty excited about that.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you, Ms. Mercer, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to meet with me and talk about this important issue. It really gave a lot of light to a lot of things. I learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you for continuing the fight. It makes me feel better.